Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parasha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamet in Highland Park, New Jersey, at the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation, Anshe Amen. And joining me, my good friends, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanowski, Anshe Chesed, New York City, Rabbi Barry Chesler in the Solomon Schechter, representing Solomon Schechter Day School of Long Island. It's great to see you. We're recording this early in the week, so you'll be surprised to get this in your YouTube feeds earlier in the week. Because I'm going to Israel tonight on Sunday night, flying to Israel tonight. I'm going to be there for 10 days to visit my son and daughter and their respective others. And just looking forward to that. But we got to do the Parasha Talk. We got to do the Parasha Talk for Mishpatim. Mishpatim. And it's also Shabbat Shalom, which we probably won't get into. Mishpatim starts with the words Ve'ela HaMishpatim. Ve'ela HaMishpatim Asher Tasim Lifnehem. These are the statutes, the ordinances, the mishpatim that you will place before them. I just want to do the one Rashi to set us up here. Kol makom shenemar ele. Everywhere it says the word ele, pasalat haroshanim. It means it just kind of sets aside what comes before it. Ve'ele mosif al harishonim. When it adds the conjunctive, the and, this is in addition to. And so the question then is, what is the place of these mishpatim? How do they function in the context of the general revelation of Sinai? And quite frankly, how do they function as a legal code within the legal codes of ancient Israel? And for bonus points, how does it function in Jewish law? So let's take on these very, very simple topics.
Well, since you brought up the Rashi, I'm just going to continue down on the Rashi a little bit, and with a reference to something that perhaps our folks will find interesting. That the same Rashi's, many of you know, major Bible commentary, France, 1040 to 1105. That was the length of his shiur, from 1040 to 1105. They studied Bible, but
he thought he was doing Parasha Talk. He often went over.
He mostly was, he would draw whenever he could to explain the semantic meaning. He would try to draw on classical rabbinic midrash, and this one I think does come from the Mechilta, the Mishnaic era midrash on Exodus, and it says, this is what you should place before them. God says to Moses, don't think, I'm going to tell them a little bit now, and I'll tell them a little bit later, and it's going to be a little bit fragmentary and scattered all over the place. But, I'm not going to, I as a teacher, I don't have to get this really, really clear. L'chach ne'emar, that's why it says, Asher tasim lifnehem, that you should place before them, keshulchan ha'aruch, umuchan le'echol lifnei adam, like a well-set table, arrayed, ready for a person to eat. And as it happens, to place before, the biblical idiom to place before you does usually refer to food. Actually, they place such and such before the person means that they gave them food to eat. And so that is the idea of the code being, supposed to be very practical, detailed. It tells you what to do right out there. That's why our major legal code from the 16th century is called the Shulchan Aruch, the set table, based on that Rashi, or that phrase may or may not be in the Mechilta itself. But the idea is that the code, we made this covenant last week and the Parasha last week, and the pyrotechnics and the experience of meeting God is very, very powerful. That'll happen again at the end of our Parasha this week. But it's got to have some content, and the content has to be, here's how you deal with wealth and poverty. Here's how you deal with holidays. Here's how you deal with torts and business conflicts, and all those things that's the substance of the covenant you just made.
Yeah, but is it so simple? Look at the first verse. Ki tikneh eved ivri shesh shanim yavod. If you buy or acquire the Hebrew slave, 6 years shall he serve you. Uvashviit yitzeh lechavshi chinam. And on the 7th year he will go free. So, you could put this in front of a 10-year-old and get, dozens and dozens of questions, not the least of which is, how is it that there's slavery in the Bible, and what does it say about slavery? And then for a much more mature person, what can you say does the Bible include things that we find repugnant, morally repugnant, which would be slavery, and to what extent does that belong? And so all of a sudden, the set table, which has what seems to have clear laws, is actually an opener for big conversations.
So in the modern world, this discussion was in some ways best encapsulated by an exchange of letters between Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig on the meaning of revelation. Martin Buber was very big on this idea that revelation was an event with no content. It was a meeting between God and Israel. And Rosenzweig believed that law could come out of revelation. And it was a difference that had in part to do with their levels of observance. Buber mostly non-existent, and Rosenzweig in the famous phrase "not yet," when he was asked if he did a specific mitzvah, either he did it or he was on the road to doing it. But here, I think what we have is an attempt to take a known body of law, which is, I think, is what the covenant code is, and attach it to Mount Sinai. So the set table that Jeremy discussed is actually an explanation, I think, of sorts of the revelation. So we have this great scene last week in chapter 19 and 20 of Revelation at Mount Sinai. And what comes out of it, what you're supposed to feast on, are the details of the law that are going to begin in our Parsha this week and carry through most of the rest of the book of Exodus.
Can you just explain to me, when you say the word feast on law, how you interpret that, and what does that metaphor mean?
Well, I was thinking about this, and there's a great phrase for a collection of law, which is a digest. Okay. But we mostly know the word digest from eating. So there is a connection linguistically on some level, perhaps mostly in my imagination, granted, between law and food. And I think the idea is that the law is supposed to be digestible, meaning you can work your way through it. It's not supposed to give you heartburn, some kind of gastrointestinal disease, but you're supposed to be able to digest it, understand it, and apply it. And then perhaps, if we want to continue the metaphor, eliminate it.
Would you go as far as saying, I am spiritually sustained by my perusal, analysis, study of, and mastery of the law?
I think this came up last week. I think on some level in the conservative movement, we believe that no matter what our particular adherence is to Jewish law in general or in specifics, we're not willing to jettison it. It's an important part of our core Jewish identity. And, speaking as three rabbis, I imagine in some ways our observances are relatively close together, but probably some great divergences. But I want to point out one other thing. So you talked about the abhorrence of slavery. And one of the things that always strikes me when I read chapter 10 of Mishnah Pesachim is that the premise of the rabbinic seder is someone is serving you. That the definition of freedom in the Tannaitic period is not free the way we understand it as good Americans or North Americans, to include Elliot, of course, but as people that other people serve, right? It's mazgulo kos rishon. Someone else is pouring that cup of wine for you. You don't have to do it yourself. So we have to really work through what we actually find repugnant, because I think it's more embedded in our tradition, not just a biblical tradition, than we're sometimes willing to allow.
Just on that point, in that chapter in Pesachim, Rav Nachman is portrayed in this monstrously obnoxious moment. He's trying to convey to his guests what the feeling of freedom like. He calls his slave Daru over and says, Daru, if I were to offer you your freedom right now, how would you feel? I said, I'd be so happy. He said, guys, that's how we're supposed to feel on Pesach. Oh my God!
Okay, but so I want to take a critical eye to that and say, that there's something that even in the Torah itself, that the Torah is unsettled by it, and the Torah itself undermines the institution of slavery, acknowledging that it exists as part of economic reality of antiquity, but is mortified by it or repulsed by it. And I'll go back to last week. It's easy to go back to the Ten Commandments, because the commandment for Shabbat really is the epitome of undermining slavery, right? You you have a commandment to observe Shabbat, your servant, your maidservant, right? So you give your servant and your maidservant a taste of freedom on one day. You don't think they're going to like that the rest of the week? And that to me says that the Torah is uncomfortable with slavery, notwithstanding the fact that it exists, and notwithstanding the fact that we find it kind of repugnant, and that immediately when we recite a verse, and I'm here thinking that we probably are in good company from rabbinic times on, or from even biblical times on. Nobody liked this idea of slavery.
Well, I wouldn't go quite that far. I think there were people that liked it, but I think your general point is an important point. But I think the other piece of it that we have to keep in mind is that a good part of Jewish tradition, although obviously not all of it, is very pragmatic. And it's based on the idea that we live in an unredeemed world. And we take baby steps towards the age of redemption, which traditionally we identify with the Messiah. And unfortunately, Jewish history is littered with moments, some lasting longer than others, where people clung to a messianic fervor such that they made the unredeemed world a lot more unredeemed than it needed to be. But our progress towards redemption is very slow. And so I think your point is well taken, that there is a dissonance between the stated law and what is actually behind it. But just as you caution that we have to be aware of that, we also can't make too much of it either.
So I think this is really important because Elliot, you posed the question, like, do we feel that the study of the law and the practice of the law is sustaining? And I think the answer for a traditional Jew has to be an unequivocal yes. Each individual person, one person's spirit may really, thrive with the details of the law, and another person says, I really prefer to study poetry or philosophy or whatever. But as a community, we are a profoundly legal culture. And this goes to exactly the things that you two are talking about right now, which is that law is never a description. When you open the Torah or the Talmud or whatever, the Shulchan Aruch, it's not a description of what people do. It's not a report about what people do. It's a prescription about what people should do. And when they invest these behaviors, the idea is it is supposed to lead somewhere. It's not, I don't relate to an idea of observance for the sake of observance and obedience for the sake of the obedience quite so much. I relate to something that's teleological, that's pointing towards a better future. And I think this is really, in the long history of Judaism and Christianity, a classic sort of anti-Jewish dig from Pauline Christianity onward is, we've got the spirit of the law and you dummies are kind of mired in the details of the law. And our answer has always been that you only get to the spirit of the law through the details of the law. And that's why the details are important. They really do make society. They really do remake, or can make society, and can remake the world if we invest these behaviors. So, which is why it matters to us that, in an ancient society, they did have attitudes towards slavery that we would not accept. They had differential attitudes towards Jewish slaves who were short-term indentured servants and non-Jewish slaves who were chattel slavery. Those things are and should be, very, very repugnant to us. But we have to recognize them as trying to, in their economic context, very different from our own, trying to make the world a better and fairer place.
All right, let me move into a different piece of legislation. We didn't talk about this before, but I want to get your reactions to this. So it says, verse 13, 21:13, Makeh ish vamet mot yumat, which means, quite literally, so if you smite a Makeh ish, smiting a person, vamet, and that person dies, mot yumat, the smiter will be put to death. So imagine you're Moshe, okay, and you are repeating these words. Okay, God said to Moshe, Mishpatim asher tasim lifnehem, these are the laws that you are to give them. And then he says, okay, Moshe, tell them, Makeh ish vamet mot yumat. Someone who smites another person who dies, mot yumat. So it's like, it reminds me of the Israeli satire show Hayudim Bayim. It's a perfect, satire, which is you're issuing a command that you've already violated. or is it? And this is where we get into this problem, which is how can you take the law in as it's written without interpreting it?
Moses, explain that.
So back in chapter 2 of Shmot, we have this moment where Moses grows up. He sees the suffering of his brothers. Vayar ish mitzri makeh ish ivri. He sees an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew. Vayifen kol vacho. He looks this way and that way. Da 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 da. Vayach et hamitzri. He smites the Egyptian. Vayitmaneo bacho. It doesn't tell us that he killed the Egyptian. It just says that he smites him and he buries him. Okay, because
It stands to reason that he killed him.
Because he stopped breathing. Because as we tried to act this out once, and a defense for Moses was, I didn't hit him. I did. He walked into my fist. He just.
Do you realize like if you've seen? I mean, this is all talking about movies here, but they didn't have like Glocks or 9mm. We're talking about like to smite somebody until they die. It's got to be an act of just truly for us.
Unless he's a football player, and you happen to. Do you remember the Buffalo football player who was
DeMar Hamlin? Yeah,
they tried to tackle him, and they got him right on the chest, and his heart stopped.
Yeah, that was a 1 in a million thing.
Exactly. So here you could say that Moses smiting the Egyptian, he hit him on the chest. It was right at the defibrillating moment, and the guy collapsed. And of course, they didn't have 911 and ambulances. Then the guy died.
Right, but I think we can't lose sight of the fact that a law code is shorthand, because as Jeremy said, it needs interpretation. And if Moses had been put on trial, his defense would be that the Egyptian that he smote was also smiting someone.
It was a Rodef. Yes, he was acting in defense of the otherwise victim, because you remember the guy was Makeh ish ivri me'echav. He was smiting one of. Oh, that was the two. That's the two Israelites. But
yeah,
same story.
But here, I think that it's not far-fetched to reason that there's an element of intent and motive embedded in the commandment. It's not just that you happen to hit someone. This comes up in discussions a lot when we talk about the difference between thou shalt not murder and thou shalt not kill. Because even in my school, a lot of students think, at least on some level, that the sixth commandment is thou shalt not kill. But it's thou shalt not murder, because self-defense and war are notable to the commandment. And I think here, this is not the law that governs Moses.
Well, but you're only saying.
Although Ramban, if I remember correctly, thought this was why Moses did not get into the promised land.
Okay,
so
fine.
In fact, he was punished for killing.
But what I'm trying to say is that already we're trying to adjudicate here a situation, by saying here's the law. The law is pretty unequivocal, but actually the law needs to be interpreted. Go to the next verse.
Of course, the law needs to be interpreted, but before I just leave this real quick, let's just note one important difference between the 10 commandments of Parsha Yitro and the Code of Mishpatim. Lo tirtzach, that is an exhortation. Do not murder. That's how you should behave. That is a apodictic, is to use that fancy phrase. This tells you how to behave. The casuistic law, makeh ish v'met mot yumat, when the following thing happens and one person smites another one, they should be put to death. That's a totally different kind of law, because not only is it telling you how to behave or not to behave, it's telling you that there's a punishment, a specific punishment. It legislates the death penalty, which is like, it seems to be all the difference in the world.
I'm only laughing at you because you said it, they should be put to death, which always reminds me when I kind of roll through a stop sign. I make a stop, but it's not the halachic stop. And someone says, usually it's one of my children says, you should stop. And I said, suggested.
So what you should go to, I think, is verse 15.
I was going to go there.
Okay. So your parent, it doesn't matter how hard you hit them. If you raise your hand to them, you're killed.
Okay, so fine. So, and would any parent put their kid to death because they raised their hand to them?
Well, so what's missing here is what was the motive and the force of the blow, right? Because makeh is often understood to attempt, if not deliver, a lethal blow. So it's not like a love tap to your parent and all of a sudden you're going to be executed. Is that you raised a murderous hand to your parent and it doesn't matter what the results are, you're subject to the death penalty.
But you're applying a layer of interpretation, which I think is just obvious. It's a necessity. You just can't adjudicate this law without trying to interpret it, because otherwise we get into all sorts of situations where the law could be completely abused.
The Parasha Mishpatim, this is of course correct. This is what gives rise to the idea in rabbinic Judaism that there's two Torot. There's Torah Shebiktav, the law, and Torah Sheba'al Peh, the law as explained orally. But in addition, Parashat Mishpatim does include what this is not the simple meaning of the phrase, but this is how the rabbi takes it. The rabbis take it is the principle of majority rule in disputes, Acharei Rabim Latot, which means that the implicit premise of the idea that the legal system is, okay, we're going to have a group of people discussing it. They're going to constitute a court. They're going to disagree. And sometimes we're going to have to settle the disagreement by voting.
Yeah. All right, go the Nevishu Micharo, the kidnapping and selling them into slavery. It says, Vinim Savi Adomo Tuman. Okay, so they find the person, but this is Joseph, right? Selling Joseph as a slave, that's the death penalty. But go to the next verse. Never mind raising your hand or fist to your parents, even if you curse your parents.
Right, but here I think we have to explain what curse means.
Oh.
And I think the curse is to invoke a divine power to kill the recipient of the curse, right? It's not what we call cursing swear words. It's an invocation of the divine power against someone.
Okay. And obviously, by the way, this is the relationship of these stories. You're pointing out the stories in Breshit and the early part of Shemot, but also the relationship of these specific rules to the Ten Commandments, I think, is a rich relationship, which is to say that, Ten Commandments, hooray, it was beautiful, the mountain was quaking in the divine voice, and Moses speaks, and God answers in thunder. No, we're turning these things into structures of society, legislations, that because you can't get to all the electricity without the nitty and the gritty.
Yeah.
I want to add one other point. The premise of the covenant code seems to be a court system, that it's not simply the application of the law, but it requires some kind of discussion to see how the law fits the given situation.
So we're trying to construct a society here, a more just society, to coin a phrase.
Well, the question for me is not just about constructing a just society, but how does this filter down to the Israelites? In other words, I think most people in this country think of themselves as good Americans, even though we hardly ever look at the Constitution. We never look at the federal or state law codes.
Tax
grow
code.
up.
Tax code.
What?
Read the federal tax code, thousands of pages.
Well, yeah, that's why we have Shabbos, for that kind of reading. Anyway, the point is, we grow up in a society, as Chaim Soloveitchik once pointed out, learning how to do things by imitating people who do them, who are elders. And the question for me is, how did this resonate with the average Israelite? Was he aware of the law code, or he just knew that everyone's expected to behave in a certain way, and if you don't, you're going to be hauled to court, and then you'll find out what's going on?
So the premise is that there must have been something that people could remember, right? When it comes to, let's say, ayin tachat ayin, shein tachat shein, that kind of thing, eye for an eye, that's a memorable line. And of course, it doesn't mean, what we think it means, an actual eye for an actual eye. But so some code, some part of the law does lodge in people's memory, and it is an oral culture, and people do, they'll understand. They'll at least understand the Ten Commandments. Maybe they'll commit the Ten Commandments to memory, and they'll say, oh, they'll be reminded when they want to steal something or kill someone. All
right. So, Elliot, in this oral culture, we know from Sefer Devarim, the law is read only once every 7 years.
Right. Okay.
Right at the Hakel ceremony, and I think in chapter 28 of Devarim. So, is that enough?
No. Well, it is true. You have this assemblage of the, but there's also there's an idea of by the time Deuteronomy rolls along, which some years after this code.
It's just in a few months, I think.
Culture is constituted by repetition, so that you do, and ultimately, as Jeremiah says, you're not going to need one person to tell another person how to behave, because the law will be written on their hearts. And so ultimately, that's what we're going for, is you can internalize these things. But I just, whatever. It's an incredibly important question that I don't know how we would go about answering. It seems to me incredibly unlikely that the ancient biblical Israelite was talking about the law, but it seems to me incredibly likely that the ancient biblical Israelite was having some problems with somebody stealing somebody else's property, and they go to the class of people who actually do know the law, who figure out that you owe this guy 4 drachma.
Yeah, and that we have a constitution of sorts. We have a basic law. Okay, let's jump to the end of the parsha. Where the people ratify this, and it's such an extraordinary ceremony with sacrifice, with blood, with fire, with all sorts of things. Moses sprinkling the blood. In chapter 24, like Kach Moshe Chatzi Adam Vayasem Ba'aganot, he takes half the blood, puts it in the kind of basins, and Chatzi Hadam Zarak al Mizbech, he throws half the blood on the altar. So we're all in ritual territory.
Right. What happens to the other half?
Sprinkles on the people.
Sprinkles on the
right.
altar.
So what is that all about?
That's consecration. You sprinkle blood, it's consecration. It's indexing.
So I kind of look at it more as possession.
Possibly also great.
That's God taking possession of the people.
Okay, well, take it out.
By the way, Elliot, you really, brilliantly interpreted that when we're talking in Exodus 12 about placing the blood on the house becomes the altar. And so here, perhaps the same thing is true, that the people are also sanctified, so to speak.
Absolutely. The placing of blood is ownership. It's sanctification. It's a kind of, it's like anointing in some way, but different. It's placing a life essence on him. And but beyond that kind of symbolic, deep symbolism, here's the vocalization. Vaikra Boznei Ha'am. He reads it, but I love that he puts it in their ears, right? Vaikra Boznei Ha'am. It's like, hello, this is what you're supposed to do. So, if you have a Hebrew slave, and they say everything that God said, we will do, and we will understand, we will listen, we will obey. And as I'm saying this now, with it's like, it's enough. We'll do it. We'll do whatever you say. Just stop the blood.
Stop throwing blood on us.
No, but seriously, all right. These are two of the most important words of the tradition, and yet, well, react. What's going on here? I mean, and in light of certainly what comes after, is this a great?
So I think that this is in a sense the counterpart to Revelation, and we tend to think of Revelation as being unidirectional from God to the people. But Revelation requires a response from the people. And without the people's response, the revelation itself is without meaning, because it's not what the revelation means to God, the omniscient, it's what it means to the people.
So just go a second back to Buber and Rosenzweig, which so restate what you just said in light of Buber and Rosenzweig. Buber is like, so there's revelation.
So, Buber had his issues, of course, as we all do, but he was most emphatic that law and revelation were two distinct. Law never measured up to revelation. That the individual decides how to respond.
Right.
And
why Buber is so appealing, because Buber is really...
Well, the irony of Buber is that traditionally he was more appealing to Christians than to Jews, right? Because he's considered to be an antinomian in the Pauline tradition. But Rosenzweig, I think, was more of a communitarian as well, and deferred at least in part to the community in a way that Buber didn't religiously. And so for Rosenzweig, the law could be an important component of revelation. And what's interesting to me is that when you look at modern Jewish philosophy, the person who appears in modern Jewish philosophy books is Rosenzweig and not Buber.
Not Buber at all.
Because Buber is not considered a Jewish philosopher, but more a philosopher who is a Jew.
I don't really have anything to add about that excellent presentation, but I would just say about the revelation makes no sense without the receipt. This is
nice idea.
Totally correct in a religion of Brit, right?
Which is what we have here in 24.
Exactly, a religion of covenant is not possible to be unidirectional, and the whole sweep of Judaism with the Torah Shebiktav, a written Torah, and the Torah Shebaal Peh, which even though there are elements in the Agadic tradition that says, oh, well, God also gave the Torah Shebaal Peh. Actually, that makes no sense. Not only on a historical level that it has to evolve through the centuries, but it makes no sense on the religious layer. The truth is, the Torah Shebaal Peh, God gives a Torah to earth, and earth gives a Torah back to heaven in its interpretation. So there has to be two partners to the covenant. That's what makes Judaism make sense, and it comes very clearly. One of the most famous pieces of rabbinic lore, which many listeners will have heard many times, is that God held the mountain over their heads and said, "Listen, do you accept the law or not? Wonderful if you do, and if not, smush." And so the people accept the law, and then the Talmud says in this, this is one of the most famous. Everyone knows the bit about God holds the mountain over their heads like a cask. But the rest of it is even better, which is to say that the Talmud then goes, well, then the Torah is invalid. You can't you can't coerce somebody into a covenant. And that the punchline on that Midrash is that they accepted it again in the time of Esther and Mordechai, which of course is the book in which God's name is absent. So when the people accept the Torah, they say Na'aseh v'nishma, not because God is forcing them, but because they can respond even when God is not so present, not so obviously present. Now that's religion.
So what I would add to what you said, Jeremy, which was excellent, is that this idea of Brit is what levels the playing field. Even though God has more power than Bnei Yisrael, in the Brit, God needs Bnei Yisrael. And there is a rabbinic idea of Mishutaf Bereshit, that we participate with God in acts of creation. And the truth of the matter is we have to participate with God in acts of revelation as well as acts of redemption. We tend to focus on the creation aspect, but it is a partnership, because the response is what makes the relationship. Otherwise, it's one way.
All right. I know that we're out of time here, but we have a lot of colleagues who watch and listen to our Parsha Talk. So feel free to use that one. Feel free to use that line in your sermons or Divrei Torah this coming Shabbat. But before we say goodbye, we want to thank you for watching and thank you for listening. Offer Hakarat Tov. It really means a lot to us. And feel free to share the link to this. We've all done that, and it just makes for a good conversation among people, as this one was. We look forward to seeing you next week. In the meantime, enjoy the week. Shabbat Shalom. We'll see you next week. Another edition of Parasha Talk.
Israel.
Thank you. Bye-bye.